Often, students get to the last paragraph of their essay and they just don't quite know how to wrap it up. So this video walks you through what belongs in a conclusion and things you need to avoid in a conclusion. So let's start with what belongs in one. The first thing you want to do in your conclusion is you want to restate your thesis statement. In your introduction, you have told your reader exactly what this essay is about in this thesis statement in 1 or 2 sentences, correct? Now, in your conclusion, the first thing you want to do is you want to restate that. You don't want to repeat it, you want to restate it. You want to use different words, different phrasing, and you want to tell the reader again in a summary what this paper was about. The best way to do that is to summarize the main points using at least one sentence for each of the points made. If you made 4 points in your essay, then you're going to have 4 sentences restating that thesis. The second part of a conclusion is to state a universal truth. And by that I mean you can do one of 3 things. First, you could actually discuss a universal truth that can be learned from the essay, something bigger or a bigger picture that can be taken away. Or you can state a consequence. If you don't do what I mentioned in the essay, then this is what may happen or this is what will happen. Or thirdly, you can give the reader some advice, some things they can do to help fix the problem or help address the issue that you discussed in your essay. So that second part of that essay really gives the reader something to do or something to ponder. And the third part of your essay is to revisit the hook statement. Go back to the very beginning of your essay, go to that first 1 to 2 sentences and figure out how you can revisit that. If you ask a question, answer that question or repose it in a different way. If you told a story or a little anecdote, remind me of that person or that event that happened. If you gave a startling fact or an interesting fact, remind me of that. So it's a nice little way to wrap that the essay up into a nice, neat little bow because the very first thing you mentioned is also the very last thing you mentioned. Include all of these 3 parts into your conclusion and always put them in this order. So, to review, restate that thesis statement first and use as many sentences for as many points as you made. Then you're going to state a universal truth by either a truth that can be learned from it, a consequence that will follow if we don't do what's in your essay, or give the reader some advice. And lastly, revisit that hook statement, answer that question, give that startling statement again, remind us of the story you told. If you put these 3 things in your conclusion and you put them in this order, it will be a perfect conclusion every time. So let's look at some of the things that students will often put into a conclusion that don't belong there. First thing they may do is restate the thesis statement without making any significant changes to the words or the phrases from the original statement. You have to use different words. You don't want to repeat anything. You want to restate it. Another thing we often see in conclusions that don't belong there is introducing new ideas or new information. You don't want to put anything new in there. You're not going to introduce a new topic. You're not going to provide a new quote. You're not going to ask any new questions. Nothing along those lines is what should be in there. Nothing new. You also don't want to focus on a minor part or minor point in your essay. You want to give equal space to each point in the conclusion when you are summarizing it. You don't want to focus on just one part. You want to focus on all the parts. So we don't want to do those 3 things. Here are 3 more things that we often see in conclusions that don't belong there. Students will focus on that final point or that last paragraph that they wrote. You just finished writing the essay and you saved your best point for last or your strongest point for last. And then you get into that conclusion and you just focus on that final point. You don't want to do that. Even if you're using that emphatic approach, that's where that strongest point's at the end. You don't want to make that the focus of your conclusion. Your conclusion is a summary of all parts of the essay. You don't want to apologize or make excuses for your lack of knowledge on the subject. You have researched this, you've been spending weeks writing it. Don't apologize for any shortcomings. You also don't want to compensate for an incomplete structure. So if you ran out of space and time to address everything that you really wanted to, you've done some really great research and you found a couple more quotes or statistics that you think would look really good in your essay, don't put them in the conclusion just because you have them. A well-structured essay, you'd be able to find a place to put those in the body of the essay. The conclusion is not where you do that. So you don't want to do those three things as well. All right, so let's go back to what goes in the conclusion and some hints to help you. So I told you the three things that go into your conclusion in the order in which you put them in. So some ways to help you as you are writing. It's called the so what game. This is where if you're not really sure how to do your conclusion, you work with a friend. You play what I call the so what game. You ask a friend to read the conclusion with you. And as each point you discuss in your conclusion, your friend will say, so what? Or why should I care about that? And then as you ponder that question and you answer or explain those things to your friend, those are the things that go into your conclusion. So if they say, so why should I care about global warming? You're going to say, because this is the reason. But then that is the summaries and the restatements that go into your conclusion. Another helpful hint, when you're working on your state a universal truth, and you're really struggling to come up with a way to bring a universal truth, state a consequence, or give some advice. So think about the bigger picture. What's the broader implication of your paper? How is your paper relevant to the reader as an individual or as a member of our society? Perhaps you want to make a connection to perhaps a historic event or a movement that the reader can relate to or help hopefully understand. So step back and think, what is the broader implication of the paper? If you wrote an essay on Virginia Woolf and you wrote about the way that she has influenced the writers, you may want to step back and look at an even broader implication. How did she influence the feminism movement that happened? So step back and take a look at the bigger picture and hopefully be able to come up with ways that the reader can connect. Now let's discuss some approaches to conclusions that you really want to try to avoid. The first one is what I call, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. This is where the writer just simply restates the thesis, writes a really short conclusion, and doesn't make the reader think deeply about the subject. They're like, this is what I wrote, this is what I said, and that's what you need to know. So that's my story, I'm sticking to it. Usually students write this conclusion when they're rushed, they're trying to get that essay done and get it turned in by the deadline, and they're not really thinking it through, or they have some type of writer's block. They don't know what goes in a conclusion. But if you follow the three things I've given you, then you're not going to be doing that's my story and sticking to it. That we want to avoid is what I call the Sherlock Holmes. And this is where the writer is trying to do a conclusion that just creates a feeling of suspense. You're writing your paper and you wait until the very end of the essay to provide us with a very clear thesis statement. That's where you would say, and so as you can see, from everything that you have learned in this essay, and then provide your thesis statement. You don't want to do that. We're not creating suspense. This is an academic essay. It's not a novel. You're not trying to make the reader be surprised at the end. You're going to state your thesis at the beginning of the paper and don't keep the reader guessing about the topic or the points of your essay. Our next type is what I call America the Beautiful. This is where the conclusion draws on the emotion of the reader to make a point, and you do it to the point of being overly sentimental. You're going to go in there and you're going to talk so wonderfully about the person or the topic that you wrote that you're like, oh, America is just so beautiful. It's great. They're the best thing that's ever happened. Let's go, America. It's not what we're doing, right? You don't want to be so out of character from the rest of the paper that it draws away from the points that you've made and the academic tone that you've created. It's an ineffective way to write. You want to write a sophisticated conclusion that doesn't have a lot of emotion in it or none at all, and you're going to be much more effective. The only real emotion that you want to create in your paper is in your state of universal truth, and you do not want to go overboard. And the last approach you want to avoid is what I call the grab bag. And this is the type of conclusion that students write when they have so much research that they have left over that they just feel like they need to put it in. You found some really awesome quotes and you just can't wait to put them in there. Or you have another point that you want to include, but really not enough to be a body paragraph, so you toss it in the conclusion. It's kind of like this grab bag of just everything that's left over that you didn't fit into the body. You don't want to do that. Your research is interesting. You want to include those things. But if it isn't interesting enough and important enough to include it in your essay, it needs to be in the body. It doesn't belong in the conclusion. Remember, we don't put new information into our conclusion. If you cannot find an adequate place for that information within your essay, it doesn't belong in the conclusion. It's got to belong somewhere else, or you have to leave it out. So very quickly, let's do a quick practice where we're going to look at an introduction paragraph and see if we can write a conclusion or how we would formulate a conclusion from this introduction. So this is an introduction to an essay that I saw at one point a student wrote. And what he was doing was he was writing about the importance of understanding that you don't have to play a sport from the time you're 5 years old to become a professional at it. So here was his introduction, and I've shortened it a little bit, of course. What do all-star basketball player Tim Duncan, World Cup winner Alex Morgan, and high school standout golfer Ian Tallman all have in common? They all took quite some time to warm up to their sport of expertise. Many young people play sports, and many have dedicated to their game as long as they can remember. However, some athletes find their game in a different way. Some start later on, while some try out plenty of sports before finding their passion. So he's got his hook statement in there. He's got just a little bit of background. I took out a lot of the background, and then his thesis statement. Those are what belong in our introduction. So now let's write a conclusion. Essentially, you're just going to flip that over, right? So I'm going to look at the thesis statement first, and I'm going to reword that. So he's got, however, some athletes find their game in a different way. Some start later on, while some try out plenty of sports before finding their passion. I'm going to summarize that and restate it in 3 sentences. He's got 3 points that he made, so I'm going to summarize that in 3 sentences. Next, I need to take a look at a universal truth or a consequence or something that they can relate to on a broader scale. So I don't quite remember what this student wrote, but it might have been something along the lines of how this can apply to more than just athletes. Instead of just talking about how an athlete can find their passion later in life, we can talk about how people find their careers later in life as well. You didn't realize until you were halfway through college that you love chemistry and you decided you want to be a chemical engineer instead of being a science teacher. So you can figure out ways to imply how trying out things throughout your whole life and not sticking with one thing can sometimes be good. And then lastly, for my conclusion, I need to revisit that hook statement. So for this one, I'm going to remind the reader who Tim Duncan, Alex Morgan, and Ian Tallman are. So I may say something like, and just like Tim Duncan, Alex Morgan, and Ian Tallman, you don't have to focus on one thing from the age 5. You can keep going and keep loving and keep trying everything until you get to the end. Let's look at the video assignment that you have for this one. Of course, it's in 2 parts. First, you are going to read the introductory paragraph that I have following this slide. You'll have to pause it, read it, and I want you to compose a concluding paragraph that uses the guidelines that I've given you for this video. Write those 3 things that need to be done in there. So again, do what we just did. Flip that baby over, restate that thesis, give me a universal truth, and revisit that hook statement. Part 2, you are going to copy and paste the conclusion of your current essay for this class into the assignment. I want to see what you've written at this point. Then I want you to follow the guidelines that I've given you in the video, rewrite the conclusion to include the 3 components of a strong concluding paragraph, and provide that to me so I can see it.